So this is the composer Emma Butterworth, and I'm speaking to her today because she has written an opera called Orchard Street, which is based on Bristol's links with the slave trade. Emma lives in Bristol herself. She lives on Orchard Street, that is her road, and her opera features characters who lived on her road, which is a 300-year-old road. Let me pass over to you at this point, Emma.
Yeah, so I moved onto Orchard Street in 2016 and started researching just the history of the road because I wanted to know about my house and I wanted to find out who lived there because that's 300 years of people, which is just quite incredible. And the census only started in the 1840s, so we've got over 100 years before the census reports. So I just started going to the library, reading trade directories, and you have to read through the whole thing because they're usually just they're not done by street, they're done by name. So just to find my house, I got to read the whole of this little book. And so by extension, you then find out more about the whole street. You can't just research on one house because you've got to look through everything. So I just gathered a huge amount of information after a while about who lived in all the different houses and looking at the original reports of when the houses were built. And I didn't have the idea to write an opera festival. It was just, I just was finding out stuff. And
just
that's
interested for its own sake.
Exactly. And after a while, I thought, I've just got so much here. What am I going to do with it? I feel like it's a nice little slice of local history, sort of the span of 300 years. You start with the street being built. It's a very affluent area at that point, up and coming. And then in the sort of late Victorian era, it was starting to go down because Clifton, which was the posh bit on the hill, had been built by that point. And so now in Orchard Street, you had the kind of more professional working classes, sort of painters, milliners and things like that, but still, pretty reasonably well off. But then by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, most of the houses were boarding houses, multiple occupancy. In my house, you'd have sort of 3 families and about 18 people living in one house. And so you just get this huge sort of arc of history in one street. And I thought, shall I write a pamphlet, just a little local history pamphlet or something? And then something struck me because I'd always wanted to write an opera. And I just never found the right story. I hadn't found something I wanted to adapt, and I hadn't thought of kind of my own story. And I thought, actually, there's going to be something in here because there are loads of amazing little stories. And I think the key to a successful opera plot is, at least contemporary opera plot, is not to have something that's too complicated, not to try and it's not a novel. It has to be understandable. And so I started looking at my different pockets of history and thinking about what might give me the right story. And I wrote out these big mind maps on large bits of paper. And first of all, I was thinking, can I do a big sweep of history? That would be amazing, but then that would be like a Wagner ring cycle, which is probably not the best idea for my first opera.
Maybe your 7th.
Maybe. Let's just sort of try and keep it manageable at this point. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to sort of narrow it down to one particular period. And whilst there's interesting things all the way across those 300 years, it seemed like it would be disingenuous to ignore the early part, which is where a lot of the houses were occupied by what they call West Indian merchants, or the slave trading merchants, because that's obviously one of the darkest and most difficult periods of Bristol history to look at and to understand. And so it felt like if I didn't do that, I would be purposefully ignoring it, which felt wrong in a way. So looking at that and the people then, it narrowed down my characters to, there was a particular man who had just such an incredible name called Cranfield. Well, that was just a very let's say, story name. And he was quite well known at the time. His family were a well-known slave trading family. And as I'd found with my research, all of these families intermarried. They were very closely linked, and they often lived very close to each other, and the children got married, and it was very sort of incestuous in a way. And so Cranfield married Bridget Swimmer, and I can't say for certain that they both actually lived on the street, but their families had leases on the street. And so in my story, they both did grow up on the street and knew each other as children, but they did get married, and they had no children, which is unusual, obviously, at the time. I don't know why, but I can speculate in my story. And Bridget died at the age of 102.
Gosh.
And Cranfield died in his 80s, so a very long-lived couple. So their characters, in a way, had a lot of substance to them already, because I could read quite a lot about Cranfield. And with Bridget, I could read her will. I could read the will of her father and her mother, who both died when she was relatively young. And I can read about her brothers as well. So I can gain a picture, the bare bones, but I can gain a picture of her life. I know who her siblings were. I know that she had a sister, an older sister, who needed to be looked after by her other sisters because she was left particular money in the will. I don't know why, whether that was due to some kind of accident or disease. But you can build a whole picture of these people from sort of not huge amounts of information. There was an advert that I found in a paper when I was in the library from 1728, I think it was. And it was an advert for the sale of an enslaved person from Orchard Street. And it was advertising from Captain Githan. And this was actually quite a common practice, that slave captains would also be paid in enslaved people as well as just their wages. And sometimes they would sell these people out in the West Indies, and sometimes they would bring them back to the UK to sell them here. And so that must have been what had happened. And so all I know from the advert was that this man was originally from the Gold Coast, and that he was around 20 years old and strong. And that's all I knew, because of course they're not going to say his name or his actual age or what happened to him. He doesn't have a will, he doesn't have a birth certificate or a death certificate or a marriage certificate, and so there's nothing. And I felt like this would be a story, it was sad that there's nothing that we know, and it's so common. We can only find out the recorded things in the past, and it's the people who are not considered important that things don't get written about. And so I wanted him to become a character, and to become a very important character in my opera. And so I created a story for him that is partly inspired by the real story of a anti-slavery campaigner and ex-enslaved person called Ottobah Cugoano from the late 1800s, actually. And he wrote an incredible account and anti-slavery tract about his own life and what he felt about slavery, and published it. And he was quite well known at the time. And I read his account, and it was incredible. And the eloquence that he writes, and the feeling and the anger is so palpable. And often when you read things from that long ago, it's hard to identify with them because the language is so different. But it wasn't at all with that. It was so visceral. And so I've ended up using a lot of his words as the words of the character who I then called Kobe Amoa in the opera. A lot of his words are Ottobah Cugoano's words, because that's the authentic voice of someone that lived that experience, and it just had such power. So he became my main character, and Bridget Betcher. So again, I know a lot about her, but compared to the men, I know a lot less than I do. So her character, from the bare bones of what I know in reality, I could build quite a lot around that. And so they became the two main characters in the opera.
I see. So different characters require different degrees of fleshing out.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and so we've got these three characters. Are there others from
There are sort of secondary characters. So yeah, Bridget and Kobe are the two main characters, and Cranfield is supporting. And then there are three other characters that come in a little later for a dinner party who also did live on the street. Richard Crankard, who was a slave ship captain, his wife Mary, and Esther Pigney, who was actually the daughter of Huguenot refugees from France. And all of these, so there was quite an influx of Huguenots into Bristol at various points when they were expelled or fled from France. So that's a whole other interesting area.
Yeah.
There used to be a Huguenot chapel on the end of Orchard Street, so there were quite a few Huguenots in Orchard Street itself. That's my kind of cast. And there's also a chorus, who I call them the Greek chorus, which someone said was quite confusing, but that's just more that's their role in the story. They're commenting on the action slightly and providing a sort of substance to what's going on. They're not quite of this world. They're slightly removed from it, and that's how Kobe starts as well in the opera. He's part of the chorus and not part of the real world, but gradually has his own voice, steps away from the chorus and moves into the real world until the point where he actually is back in the real world and meets Bridget again.
Okay. I mean, I'm getting a sense that it's in a way quite a multicultural opera, reflecting the kind of multicultural quality of Bristol. What about the music itself?
The music itself, yes. So it took me a while to work out sort of what my musical voice was going to be for this. Sort of, I didn't come in with a preconceived idea. I have some elements of Handel that, in a slightly weird way, came into the sort of main chorus because he is of the time, and it felt quite appropriate. But it's not a pastiche of 18th century music, but it's also, I guess, my background is in composition for film, and I like to write, how to put it, melodic, tonal music, and so I felt that the music that I was going for here is, I want people to, that a lot of the story and a lot of the history and a lot of characters, it's all very dark, it's all very sad and awful, and I felt like in order for people to want to hear this, and I feel like it's an important story, telling an important part of our history. But if I hit people with bleak, difficult music as well, then I don't think that would work. And so the music, in a way, juxtaposes some of those themes that allows people to feel and experience the story, but not to be beaten down by it.
I can see, yes, yes. I guess there can be a danger if you're using music which is too difficult, too bleak, that the whole thing could risk turning into a bit of a lecture.
Yeah.
Especially if you're dealing with such a controversial topic as well.
Exactly, and I think that even in the darkest things, there can be beauty found and hope, and I wanted the music to reflect some of that as well. And even with these difficult themes, that there is some hope there.
So including nuance.
Yes.
I see. I see. So a mixture of influences. I know a lot of your previous music. I mean, do you still have a band? You definitely did have a band.
Not anymore, but
Okay.
I did have a band.
Okay. Well, Emma had this band, and the music that you performed with this band, it was, oh God, how do I describe it? It's sort of, I want to say Victorian steampunk.
Yeah, steampunk, folk steampunk.
Folk steampunk with but some kind of gothic Victorian thing going on.
Yeah,
Yes, kind of quite creepy in a good way.
yes.
Yeah. Are you going to be channeling some of that?
I mean, there's a little bit of that. There's always part of me that likes the sort of gothic creepiness, and so there's some elements of that in a way. It's not the same kind of music, but yeah, I think you could probably see some influences if you knew both of if you knew some of my band work and my songs that I wrote for that.
Okay, so I'm getting the sense that you don't necessarily want the audience to come away with a certain viewpoint. You're not trying to persuade them of anything.
I think I don't need to persuade people that slavery was bad. I mean,
yeah, it speaks for itself, but
that's pretty obvious, and it's I think it becomes sort of, I feel like you don't want to treat your audience like children. We all know a certain amount about the period and about this sort of thing to different degrees. But yeah, I think there is a lot of nuance that can be brought into this. And oh, you just disappeared slightly.
Sorry, yeah, my screen froze for a second.
That yeah, no one is entirely good or entirely bad, or at least very few people are. And I felt very much as I was writing this, especially when I was thinking about Bridget Betcher's character. So she has a very privileged life, very good life, but what's it built on? It's built on the proceeds of something really dark and bloody. And people knew that at the time, but they obviously found a way to compute it, to not think about it in that way. And we do exactly the same in our lives now with different things. You know, there's child labor in countries that produce our clothes, and we still buy cheap clothes. And we fly long haul holidays when it's destroying our planet. And it doesn't mean that
we are bad people, that
everyone is evil. But I think as humans, we have a great capacity to ignore things that are uncomfortable for us and difficult for us. And that is part of what humans can do. That's why we're successful, I think, as a species.
Yes, and I suppose if you're surrounded by other people who think the same way, I guess it's important to remember that everyone is a product of their time and of the people who surround them in that time.
Exactly. And I don't mean that in a way to excuse what people have or haven't done in the past or present, but I think in order to, it's important not to other these people too much, to go, we are not like that. We are enlightened and we are better than them, and we're not necessarily. You know, there are different things. I think in 300 years' time, people might be absolutely appalled that anyone would eat animals. You know, that could seem as unthinkable then as it is now, sort of, for us to talk about enslaving other people. And so I think nuance is difficult, but important.
It is important, I guess, because it allows you to look at something, to watch an opera, say, and think, oh gosh, how does this have any relation to how I'm living now? How can I learn something from this, rather than thinking, oh gosh, well, I'm glad that, you know, we don't do this anymore.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean we're not responsible for our choices, because I think we are, and we should be thinking about the things that we want to ignore And so I think, yeah, that if there is a message, that's the message that I want people to sort of take away from it.
Okay. And is there anybody in the opera who actually lived in your house?
No, they're mostly on the other side of the road. Our side has sort of slightly smaller houses, and the other side of the sort of bigger, sort of seriously posh houses. And so that most of the
that's where the action happens.
Yeah, the really important people lived on the other side of the road. So no, in my house, I had, I mean, there was a tiler and decorator who lived here in the 18th century for quite a long time. And in the 19th century, there was a portrait artist who was a kind of low-level portrait artist. And we have a copy of his self-portrait, which we found in his self-portrait is in a drawer in the Bristol Museum. And we knew that it was there, and so you can go and ask to see things that are in their collections. And so
okay, and I remember you also found a program a concert program in your house, didn't you? Of a concert that took place there 100 years ago.
That was it was a playbill from what is now the Old Vic, that was the Royal Theatre, and that I think was from about the 1790s.
Okay, but the program was in your house.
Yes,
the playbill was in your house.
Playbill was sort of stuffed in a corner under a wall, sort of under the floor. Probably to like stuff up a mouse hole or something.
Just God, what a great
stuff, and sort of we unraveled it.
What a great, I mean, to go on an archaeological dig in your own house, isn't that?
Yeah. And we found all sorts of sort of, a lot of the stuff had been cleared out from under the floors from previous renovations, but we still managed to find some things, a beautiful sort of old playing card from probably the same era, the King of the Hearts, and a little tiny little advert for a kind of school for young ladies, Mrs. Bagnall's school that was in Long Ashton, and it had a little rate card with all the different costs of the types of lessons that you could have. So you obviously went, well, I'm going to send my daughter there, and she's going to do dancing and French and music was one of the most expensive ones. So I don't know if it's because the instruments provided, or maybe it was because she got in a specialist music teacher, perhaps. But
I see. Oh my goodness. I mean, with this wealth of history in your own house, is that, well, first of all, I want to ask, this opera, where is it? It's not being performed in your house? Because that was my first thought. Is she actually going to do it in her own house?
No, the plan is for it to be in the street, actually.
Okay. It is going to be performed in the street. That's the premiere.
That's the plan, yeah, to have a short run in the street, because it's a cul-de-sac, and so it's got great acoustics, actually.
Oh, really? So it's made for it?
Yeah. So it will be quite an undertaking, but that is what I want to do.
And do you have a date?
Not yet. It's probably at least a year's time.
Okay, fine. So you're in the completing and planning stage at the moment.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and further down the line, is there scope to do either the opera or something similar in your house based on the further history? I know you said that this was one little period of time that you wanted to focus on, but that there were many others.
I could, opera number 2 could just be a different period. There's some wonderful stuff from the late 19th century, when they were houses of multiple occupancy, boarding houses, and a lot of this, quite a few of the children who came up in the census records, and some of them popped up in newspaper articles as well, then went on to fight in the First World War, and some of them were sadly killed. And so I can trace their sort of early years in Orchard Street and in our house, and through to their graves in France and Belgium.
Gosh, so that could be opera. I mean, there could be a whole fleet of operas really based on the history of your house. It could be like this Forsyte saga, following a family down through the generations.
That's, strangely enough, I hadn't actually thought that might be, I should have done, but I hadn't thought of it. That's a very good idea.
But I mean, I guess, you probably wouldn't, I don't know whether you'd have a family that lived in the same street for
generally not, sort of, we're a bit more itinerant than that, but picking a different, like you say, there were so many stories, so many people. There was on the other side of the road again, of course, there was an American general who came here after England lost the War of Independence in the US. And he was one of the generals in America who was fighting on the British side. And obviously when we lost, couldn't really stay there. And so he and his family came over to England and lived in Orchard Street for a while.
Okay.
And Skinner, I think another great name, General Skinner.
Great names.
So there's all sorts.
Gosh, so there is a lot of potential there. I mean, that could sustain you through a whole career, really, just following the history of your street.
It could, and they would all be very different.
Yes, and you don't need to hire a venue because you've got your gorgeous house, which we can see behind your head there, and you've got your gorgeous road. So in a way, it's all you're like a little island. You're completely self-sufficient.
Yes, yeah. The shutting off the road and having all of
maybe
associated
depends
stuff.
on, I don't know how amenable your neighbours are, but
quite amenable, which is good. It's a nice little community. So a lot of people are aware of the opera's existence and supportive of it, which is helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a community opera in the absolute sense of the word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, Emma, I am so looking forward to hearing how this pans out and to seeing the opera when it. Please let me know when it's about to go on the road. Literally about to go on the road. Yes, it's been so great to talk to you about it. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you, Hannah.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more of the same, then feel free to hit subscribe on our channel, or for more similar coverage, visit our website at www.thecuspmagazine.com. Thanks, and I'll see you another time.